Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the MSI MEG X399 creation. A really awesome motherboard with a really stupid name. Like seriously, what is it? What the hell is that? MEG X399 creation. Like, that is just, I think, the worst motherboard name ever. Like, yeah, like it's ahead of Gigabyte's Designere, whatever the hell that is. Like that's almost as bad. This is worse because this is longer and makes just as much sense. Anyway, this is a pretty epic motherboard. Pictures were sent in by a viewer, so huge thanks to the guy for sending them in. And yeah, let's get right into it. So the motherboard does have a few overclocking features. You have some debug LEDs up here. You get your dual 8 pins, so board can handle like input power at least 960 watts max. So, you know, plenty of power. Though on LN2, I think you actually start exceeding, like, so far people like the LN2 scores that have come out on the 2990X. It looks like the CPUs are getting either very close or might even be exceeding that. It's like there's not that much information on it. The other issue is that I think the big problem with these really high core count CPUs is that they get really hot. So I don't think they don't seem to be scaling to as high voltages as like your regular 2700X would, just because they run so much hotter even under liquid nitrogen. So yeah, but still. Power connectors for 960 watts. It may or may not be an issue on LN2. I don't really know. I think it could be an issue because in theory, like, the 2700X is capable of pulling 400 watts. So a 2990X at the same voltage would theoretically do 600 watts, 1600 watts. The issue is, I don't think it'll actually, like, the issue to that is it might not scale that high. Like, there's a very good chance that past, like, 1.6 volts, the 2990X just doesn't clock any better, or actually clocks worse as your operating temperature keeps just starts climbing up with the extra V-core. So that's one of the issues with on LN2 is just, like, you can't just keep ramming more voltage, because at some point the voltage is going to start overcoming the cooling capabilities of the liquid nitrogen, and then your clocks fall off again. Anyway, so dual 8 pins, debug LEDs up there. Down here we find the overclocking knob. Never ever use that. It is terrible. It's like automatic overclocking always sucks. You get a power button, a reset switch, reset button, and a postcode. So that's very nice to see. Board does not seem to have dual BIOS. So that kind of sucks. But you do have a clear CMOS and a BIOS flashback button on the rear I/O over there. So that covers the OC features. Let's get into the VRMs, which is probably what everybody's really here for. Let's start with the big one, the important one, the one that puts a smile on my face. This right here is the V-core. It's a 16 phase. And like a dumb 16 phase, because it uses a pretty dumb doubler. But it is an actual 16 phase, and I'm not going to count it out, but basically each of those makes up a phase, and there's 16 of them, and I write too slow to actually label every single phase. So that's the 16 phase. The doublers for it are on the back here, so that's these chips right here, and you can see that there's 8 of them. And so, of course, the voltage controller in use here is the ever so popular international rectifier IR35201, running in 8+0 phase mode, which means the SoC VRM gets its own voltage controller right over here. We'll get to that later. So this is a 8 phase, then it goes into the 3599s on the back of the board here. Those then interleave basically 2 phases, and what the 3599 being a dumb doubler, as I like to call it, is the issue with it is you don't have current balancing. There are doublers out there which do varying degrees of current balancing. Like Intersil has some really, really fancy ones, which actually do full-on per phase current balancing with duty cycle extensions, and those are like ridiculous and awesome. But those are really pretty expensive and rather rare. Also because Intersil, like the controllers that works with and the power stages that it works with are also rather expensive. So that's a pretty rare part to find. The 3599 does no current balancing whatsoever. It just takes a PWM signal, splits it in half, and gives one half to one phase and the other half to the other phase. So there's no current balancing. But you do still get the benefits of having a fully interleaved 16 phase, which is basically less input ripple, less output ripple. Basically, it runs better. So we can consider this a 16 phase, even if it's not like the most intelligent one out there. So then, what actual power stages do we have? Well, these should be, if you follow this channel a lot, these should like already be giving away that these are kind of special with their package. So, because they're rectangular and they're massive. At least, well, you can kind of tell they're massive. I can tell they're definitely massive. Like this is not your standard 5x5 millimeter or smaller power stage package. Nope, this is a 5x6 millimeter, which means these are a 70 amp power stage. And that's actually correct. These are Infineons, and I've run out of space. Genius. I'm an absolute genius here. I've been doing this for so long, and I still run out of space. But these are Infineon's TDA 21472 power stages. And they are 70 amps max output. The bad news is that's all I can really tell you about them, because there's no public data sheet for them. I'm actually like the only reason I know that these are capable of doing 70 amps is because I found a press release about Infineon demoing some new components and that they have a new 70 amp power stage. Now, luckily, there's same package size, same current capability, like comparable parts from other manufacturers. Texas Instruments have one. Unfortunately, that data sheet is rather sparse on the information I wanted, in at least as far as being in a convenient, accessible form goes. So what I ended up doing is I went with Fairchild's FDMF 3170 datasheet, which is also a 70 amp part. That datasheet is slightly more useful. Unfortunately, it specs all of the current output power losses at 1.8 volts instead of 1.2 volts or 1.4, which is, 1.4 is actually a lot for Threadripper. But, basically they spec it at 1.8 volts because that part, as far as I'm aware, is very specifically designed, was optimized for use on Intel Xeon servers, which have a fully integrated voltage regulator, which is very high input voltage. That's like the whole freaking point of the fully integrated voltage regulator. So they're like that entire data sheet is in 1.8 volts. And that means that my current output figures and the power efficient, like the heat output, I'm not sure if they're inflated or if they're too high or if they're too low. Because that data sheet doesn't even it doesn't specify any other voltage than 1.8 volts. So that's really unfortunate. And so these heat output figures are very, very rough. Okay, I'd say you can consider them plus minus 10%, possibly more. Okay, they're really rough because a lot of the, if you look at data sheets that actually specify how much your power loss gets worse as you raise voltage, for some of the 1.2 volts, say an IR 3550, which is a 60 amp power stage, that thing going from 1.2 volts to 1.8 volts, you see a 35 or 48% increase in power loss in heat output for any given current, which doesn't actually mean your efficiency goes down because, at 1.8 volts, you're pushing much more voltage. So for any given current, you're pushing much more power. So the actual increase in heat output doesn't translate to a massive decrease in efficiency. But basically, this is spec'd at 1.8 volts, and so I have no idea if there's a big margin of error on basically the heat output figures here, but it should give you a rough ballpark of where-ish the VRM probably is. It's really hard to, don't have the necessary information. Infineon doesn't currently even list the TDA 21472 on their own website. As like far as their own website is concerned, this part doesn't exist and isn't made by them. But you can actually buy it, and there's just no data sheet. So, like, you can buy it from various part suppliers. There's press releases about it, but there's no data sheets on Infineon's own site, which is just awesome. Like, great. I love that. Either way, so let's get to the current figures. 100 amps, and this is 500 kilohertz switching frequency, 5 volts drive. It's a power stage. Like, these run off of 5 volts. That's instead of 10 volts. So, wait, 5 kilohertz? Which idiot wrote this? 500 kilohertz. That's a proper VRM switching frequency. 5 volts drive, DRV, and 1.8 volts out. You're going to be looking at 100 amps and about 12 watts of heat output. At this point, I would actually expect the VRM to start dropping phases completely, because this is really like scraping the bottom of the efficiency curve. In fact, on some CPUs running at stock, you'd probably not see most of this VRM will be turned off. Like, it just won't be running because it is so overkill for stock that it's ridiculous. But then you start cranking it up. So 200 amps, you're going to be looking at about 20 watts of heat output. So, still very acceptable. This thing comes with a massive heatsink. Also, I do really think that 20 watt figure would be lower, because your efficiency, like, I wouldn't expect the efficiency to fall off a cliff just because you run at like 1.82 volts output instead of 1.8, but yeah, this data sheet's freaking useless. So these figures are just like all over the place. 300 amps, you'd be looking at 30 watts of heat, and yeah, like you'd be looking at around 30 watts of heat. 400 amps, you're going to be looking at about 40 watts of heat. 500 amps, about 60 watts of heat. So this is where it starts to like really ramp up with, heat output. And then 700 amps, and I skipped 600, but 700 amps, you're looking at about 100 watts of heat. So this is where I think you would top out on liquid nitrogen. That 700A figure right there. Yeah, like a lot of current and a lot of power. But at 1.5 volts, like you'd be looking at like 1150 watts of CPU power consumption, like output from the VRM. So, and about 1200, like over 1200 50 watts input power. So I'm not sure if anybody's actually pushed a Threadripper to that kind of power level yet, because as I mentioned, these things probably roll over really, really early, at least based on what so far the clock speeds that we've seen for the benchmarks. Like, people are passing Cinebench at like 5.3 gigahertz, 1.6-ish volts, which is way down from where 2700Xs would run, where 2700Xs are doing like 5.5, 5.6 at around 1.8 volts. And I do assume this is mostly a heat issue. It could also be that the motherboard just doesn't want to take it at that point. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't have a CPU. I don't think I'm going to have a CPU anytime soon. So, I don't really mind missing the launch window. I couldn't really care less. I would have been late anyway. But like I don't plan to buy one of these, and I don't really see a very high probability of me getting sampled, especially not like the 32 core. So yeah, I don't think I'll get around to, like, I'll ever get a chance to mess with one of these, and I don't really see the point in buying one, especially considering that there's a very high probability of a new GPU coming out soon, and I want that, and I know for a fact that I'm not getting sampled for that either. So, that. Anyway, this VRM is ridiculous and awesome. And, yeah, like, this is all, like, it doesn't get better. Well, no, it could be better. Like, you could have an even more ridiculous, bigger VRM, but this is really, really impressive. This is just like, because initially I was thinking MSI was going to, like, when I first heard about this board, I thought they were doing 60 amp power stages, and now that I found out it's like 70 amps, it's like it's not a huge difference, but, you know, it, like, they're really pushing the limit of what they can do. Because, like, the next step up would be doing, like, a 24 phase, which would have been, like, off of 6 phases with a ton of, like, at that point you'd be 6 phases quadrupling, and it would just be, like, that would just be ridiculous. I mean, the board already has a problem of being, like, moved down an entire, like, the entire CPU section is moved down a like a PCIe slot, because they needed to cram this VRM up here. And that VRM, of course, comes with, like, an absolutely massive heatsink. So, yeah, I approve of this VRM. I very much approve of this VRM. This is very nice. And then the heatsink that it comes with, I don't know. I don't have the board. I can't test it. I've seen some reviews. They seem to be like, yeah, that the VRM runs plenty cool. But it really should, considering just, like, how freaking powerful the VRM is. And then, like, the size of the heatsink on top of it as well. Like, at that point, just, like, with how massive it is, I don't think you need that many, like, you still need some fins, but, you know, the fact that it still looks like an art piece probably isn't harming it that much anymore. Yeah, very impressive VRM. There's not many boards with, well, there's not many boards that have a good reason to have a VRM this big. Like, there are boards out there, like Gigabyte did a 32 phase on Z77, which was just stupid. But, you know, they did it anyway. But, yeah. So this is not the most powerful VRM ever, that's for sure. But it is still very, very impressive. And very, very nice to see that, like, MSI is, like they're serious about basically powering a Threadripper 32 core. Is what, like, somebody at MSI was like, whoa, AMD... They're really pushing how much current we're going to need to be able to move. And, well, they came up with a solution that is just exactly what you would want to see. You know, there's really nothing to complain about here. So, yeah, I like this VRM. It's a 16 phase. It's doubled up. Well, no, it could be better. If Intersil made a 70 amp power stage and then they use the ISL 6617s. Now, I'm not sure that the ISL 69138 even works. No, because that's a 7 phase. You couldn't have done that. Yeah, so this might actually be the best option you have. I'm not sure that IR even makes a smarter doubler, or that Infineon makes a smarter one. Like, that ISL one is the only one I'm aware of. So, yeah, this is probably the best they could do for a Threadripper board. And, you know, like, no complaints from me then. So then, that's the V-Core. Very impressive. Next, we have the SoC VRM, which is basically 3 phases from the V-Core VRM, just on their own, controlled by this chip right over here, which this is a 35204, and that is a 3+1 phase chip, except here it's running in 3+0. And again, we have the same TDA 2121472 power stages. So, yeah, nice SoC VRM here. Same kind of issue, though, with the power figures just being all over the place. Now, for a 2950X, I would expect a SoC current draw figure of around 40 amps max, because there's two systems on a chip on that CPU. So 40 amps, you're gonna be looking at about 4 watts of heat output for the SoC VRM, and it does actually have a thermal pad, and it's like heat sinked and everything, so that shouldn't be any issue. Other than that, I'm pretty sure it would be able to do that passive. And then for the 2990X, you're gonna be looking at more. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if it did 80 amps, just because it has 4 systems on a chip. Though, admittedly, the 2 of those systems on a chip are, like, not properly used. Like, the only part of them that's running is the Infinity Fabric links. The memory controller's disabled. The PCIe controller's disabled. So those parts, aren't going to be burning any power. But that doesn't change the fact that the rest of the SoC is still being used. So it could top out at 80 amps. It'll probably top out somewhere lower just because it's not running, like, it's not fully enabled. So 60 amps, you're going to be looking at 6 watts of heat output and 88 watts of heat output. And yes, I do find, like, when I was writing up my notes for this, I found it very suspicious that most of these power figures are, like, cut off a 0, and you basically get the heat output figures. Like, it made me recheck my math a couple times, because it was just like, that can't possibly be right, right? This looks really odd. But no, that's actually what it is. Because yeah, I got surprised by that as well. Anyway, so that's the SoC VRM. It has a heatsink on it. 8 watts at 80 amps output is really not that hot. You're not pushing that much current per phase either, so no problems there. It has a heatsink, so it should be just fine. If this didn't have a heatsink, I'd be kind of concerned for it. But otherwise, since it does have a heatsink, that's cool. Though it does make me question the Zenith. Like, the Zenith Extreme has a 4-phase using 40 amp power stages, if I remember correctly, for its SoC VRM. And it's just like, those are less powerful than these. There's no heatsink on those, because Asus stuck that VRM right here. So yeah, I wonder about how that VRM does with a 2990X. Because I already know from, like, some reviews I've seen, the Zenith, like, the VRM does not like overclocking the 2990X. So, which is no surprise to me. I mean, it's an 8-phase with 60 amp power stages. Like, I don't know why anybody would have expected it to not overheat, especially considering, like, half that heatsink is a block. Like, literally, half of that heatsink is a block. And Asus has that silly little fan kit for it, because they're like, oh yeah, we designed the VRM is just not big enough. Because also, they've been copy-pasting that VRM design for, like, years now. So, I mean, well, it's finally found its match. Though I'd argue X299 also overloads that VRM as well. Like, that VR, like, Asus should have just replaced it at this point. The funny thing is, like, the Crosshair 7 Hero has a better V-Core VRM than the Zenith. So, yeah, if somebody's wondering, like, if this MSI board has a better VRM than the Zenith, this is more than 2 times the current capability of what the Zenith has, theoretical max output. So this is way better, okay? Which is why it's no surprise that this is not having thermal issues, while the Zenith apparently is. At least from the reviews I've seen so far, because I've not been able to test myself. Anyway, let's get on to the memory VRM, which is right here. So this is a 2-phase. It is ridiculous overkill. You can actually read the part numbers, and if you've watched enough PCB breakdowns of mine, then you should know what this is. That is an 8.3. Yeah, I'm going to rewrite it. And I don't know why, but for some reason, I just always put the 3 in front of the 7. 87350 CSD from Texas Instruments. That is a 40 amp power block. It is ridiculous overkill for 2 phases of that to be on the memory. Like, because that's VDDR. So that's ridiculous overkill right there. It's controlled by this chip over here, which is a PV, like, you can read it again. That's a PV4210. That's made by ROHM Semiconductor. So I don't know how that's pronounced. I'm not going to try to pronounce it. ROHM Semiconductor. It's a 2-phase, so this is a real 2-phase memory VRM. You have another one on the other side. Obviously, you need, like, you're not going to be pushing power right across like that. So 2 phases for each set of memory slots. Massive overkill with the 40 amp power blocks. Like, seriously, 80 amps for your memory VRM? Really? But, yeah. That's really nice to see. So those also run passive. Those aren't heat-synced, so it kind of makes sense that they... Well, no, it doesn't, because there's other 4-DIMM motherboards where you just have, like, 2 or 3... Well, even just 2 discrete MOSFETs. In some cases, you'll have 3 or 4, but a lot of the time, you'll just, like, you'll even get 2 on some very low-end motherboards. And admittedly, at that point, they start running really hot, but it's not like, explosion levels, but there's nothing wrong with having massive overkill. So that's really nice to see as well, and they have that on both sides. Other things worth pointing out on this board. There's 2 clock gens. You have one over here and one over here. I have no information on either of them. Let's just put it this way. The Integrated Device Technologies website is less than useful. Though, I got the datasheet for this one, and this one's, like, it's a clock gen, but it's, like, specifically for PCIe, and then there's this other clock gen, and this is outside of my area of expertise, but there's a bunch of clock gens on this board, so it should have VCLK overclocking capability. Other than that, there's also a bunch of GS Tech, GS7133 LDOs. These are 3 amps output, and they're basically here for minor voltages like the 1.8 volts. What else is there? There's like a bunch of supporting voltages for these CPUs that need to be present but don't pull a lot of current. So that's what the LDOs are for. There's a couple of those. So yeah. Oh, and for VPP, I think VPP is generated by this thing. So that's the supporting rail for the DDR4. But I don't know what either of those are because that's like that there. Like even if I could read that, those are chips that I can't ID. Like I can already tell you that that won't go through Google or any data sheet finder either because it's not long enough and it has like, yeah, can't find those unfortunately. But yeah, very, very, very nice VRM on this motherboard. Like, V-Core, you know, I couldn't ask for better, really. Because it would actually be really, really hard to build better than this. Like, MSI basically maxed out the possibilities for an X399 motherboard. Because, realistically, like, you're stuck with the 35201. You can't really go to anything else. You know, then since you're using a 35201, at that point you're basically stuck using a international rectifier doubler of some kind, so that's why we see the 3599. And then to get full feature support, you ideally want another either Infineon or international rectifier part, which is why we see the TDA 21472 70 amp power stages. Like really, I don't think that there's, you know, many other options for a X399 VRM that you could go with. Like this is basically the limit. So it's nice that MSI basically just went like they went as far as they could reasonably go. Because theoretically, if you felt like it, you could have just, you know, extended the board beyond my canvas here and thrown on, you know, another 16 phases to build a 32 phase, because the 3599 it's a doubler and a quadrupler. If you hook up more chips to it, it'll run them. So it'll do 4 chips, like it'll run 4 phases as well. At that point, it cuts your switching frequency to 1/4, but the 35201 goes up to like 2 megahertz output. So you could run 2 megahertz into the 3599s. Get 500 kilohertz on every single one of your 32 phases, and you'd have to remove another PCIe slot on the motherboard to accommodate that. And at that point, everybody would complain because already this motherboard is like on reduced slot spacing because of just how massive that VRM is. And I finally remembered what it is that I forgot. There's a cool little feature on the back of the board here. They put a hole in the CPU socket for a thermocouple if you're running it on LN2. So that's very nice to see as well. Oh, and here's the other voltage controller for memory VRM over here. So, yeah. And there's your output filtering capacitor bank for the SoC VRM. So, yeah, that's the board. I'm very pleased with what MSI has done. You know, this is the thing is like, people always ask me, like, is there a specific brand that you think is better than all the other brands? No, there isn't, because sometimes Gigabyte makes an amazing board, and sometimes MSI makes an amazing board, and most of the time Asus just makes the same board as last year with a different chipset and socket. So, you know, but admittedly Asus, like, that keeps the boards consistent, but every so often you get like really amazing boards from basically any manufacturer. Like it's basically random who has the best board for any platform. And I gotta say for X399, as far as the VRMs go, I think MSI has the winner. Because like really there's nothing anyone can do to go bigger. as far as I'm aware. Like, you can't go bigger unless you put like a daughter board on the motherboard to like get yourself more phases, or go XL ATX. Like, real, like you're running out of space at this point. Like, really, really running out of space. So then the only question remains is like, how's the overclocking and how's the BIOS on the board? Because at least on the X470, I'm not exactly impressed with MSI's BIOS. It's just like it's solid for overclocking in terms of like memory clock speed, and if you're just doing regular static overclocking, it works great. When you want to overclock with PBO, though, it kind of sucks. Last I checked, there still wasn't offset voltage. Admittedly, I checked a while ago, but I don't think MSI actually changed anything. Because they haven't had offset voltage on their motherboards. As far as I'm aware, they haven't had it since X370, and they've not managed to add it so far, so I don't think they actually even want to add it. So I don't know what the hell is up with that, but they don't have offset voltage, and if they don't have offset voltage on this motherboard, that's really unfortunate, because this is an awesome VRM, and then it's just like, oh, well, the BIOS is gonna, you know, kind of screw the board over. Well, that's the thing, is like, you know, it's why I've basically stopped, why I try to avoid doing motherboard PCB breakdowns, because a lot of the time I come across a motherboard where I'm like, oh, this is amazing, and then you find out the BIOS is just completely unusable. And at that point, it's just like, well, you can't fix like, like, unless the board vendor decides to like fix the BIOS, it's just never going to get better. And at that point, you're just screwed. So yeah, whereas at least like a VRM that runs hot, most of the time you can fix it by sticking a fan on it, unless the VRM is just way too small relative to what you're trying to power. So yeah. Anyway, that's it for the video, because yeah, I've made it unnecessarily long again, but I don't want to reshoot it. It's 1 a.m. in the morning, so that's it. Thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. Once more, thank you to the guy who sent the pictures in. They were very useful. Well, yeah, they were actually really, really good pictures. What else is there? Thanks for pictures. Right, if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon, PayPal, t-shirts. You can find a link to all of that down in the description below, and those all help out with running the channel immensely. Who knows? Maybe maybe if enough shirts sell, I'll be able to buy a Threadripper or a GTX 2080. One of the two. Probably the GTX 2080, because that doesn't require a motherboard. Right, like, that's just the GPU, and I don't think it's going to cost over $1,000. It's probably going to be like $650. Anyway, that's it for the video. Goodbye. Where's the mouse gone to? There you are. Where's the stop button?